The sharp smell of stale bread mixed with the faint odor of damp floors hit James's senses before he even noticed the boy standing there, clutching a thin, worn-out backpack to his chest. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting uneven shadows across the tiny corner store where James had stopped to grab his usual morning coffee. But this wasn't his usual morning. He wasn't used to seeing hunger so raw, so immediate, reflected in a child's desperate eyes. The boy's voice was small, trembling, yet filled with a courage that came from necessity. "Mommy hasn't eaten, can you share expired bread?" For a moment, the world seemed to freeze around James. A high-powered CEO, used to corner offices and multi-million-dollar deals, James's life was a whirlwind of schedules, board meetings, and carefully curated appearances. He was the man everyone envied on Wall Street, yet here he was, confronted by a reality he couldn't control or negotiate away. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a mixture of shock and shame, as the boy's eyes darted around the store, hoping no one would turn him away. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel. Every little act of generosity can ripple further than we ever imagine. James's first instinct was to look away, to bury himself back into his phone and pretend he hadn't heard. But then he noticed the boy's hands. They were scraped, small cuts that hadn't been cleaned, dirt under the nails, and a slight tremor from hunger. His shoes were torn, soles flapping with every cautious step, and his jacket was several sizes too big, hanging loosely from his tiny shoulders. James swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar lump rise in his throat. This wasn't a child looking for charity. This was survival. The boy's name, as James would soon learn, was Noah. He lived with his mother, Clara, in a small, crumbling apartment a few blocks away. Clara had recently lost her job at a local diner when a corporate chain opened nearby, and the bills had begun piling faster than she could pay. Noah had tried everything, selling candy on the street, collecting recyclables, even skipping school lunches to save money, but hunger was relentless. That morning, he had walked to the store hoping, praying, for even the tiniest morsel of food. James, still frozen at the threshold of the store, watched as Noah's gaze shifted from shelf to shelf, finally settling on a box of day-old, discounted bread at the back. The label read, "Expired," a word heavy with rejection, yet loaded with hope in Noah's mind. James felt his heart twist. In his world, expired meant unsellable, worthless. In Noah's, it meant survival. Something inside James shifted. The world he had built, his empire, his wealth, his carefully constructed life, felt suddenly meaningless in comparison to the small boy trembling before him. He knelt down, quietly taking off his expensive watch and placing it on the counter. "Take this," he said softly, though the words felt clumsy and inadequate. "Take the bread, and anything else you need." Noah's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with cautious hope. He had never met a stranger who offered without judgment, without conditions, without questions. For the first time that week, he felt safe. And yet, there was a flicker of hesitation, the natural instinct of a child who had been let down before. James didn't rush him. He led Noah through the store, picking out milk, eggs, and a few cans of beans, small items that would last a few days. As they walked to the counter, James asked gently about Clara. Noah's voice wavered as he spoke, the story spilling out in broken sentences about eviction notices, skipped meals, and nights spent lying awake listening to the hum of the city outside, wondering if tomorrow would bring food or more hunger. James left the store that day carrying more than groceries. He carried the weight of responsibility he hadn't anticipated. Driving back to his luxurious penthouse, he couldn't stop thinking about Noah and Clara. The contrast between his life and theirs was stark, almost unbearable. He had everything money could buy, yet he had never felt richer in the way that mattered. He had never been touched so profoundly by someone else's need. Over the next few weeks, James found himself returning to that small corner store more often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by coincidence, hoping to see Noah again. When he did, he would hand him small envelopes, discreetly, always avoiding the scrutiny of other customers. But James realized that this wasn't a solution, it was a temporary fix, a band-aid over a wound that needed healing. He needed to do more. He researched Clara's situation, learning about the evictions, the bills, the mounting medical debt that kept her from seeing a doctor. He felt an anger unlike anything he had experienced in boardrooms, an anger at a system that allowed a hard-working mother and her son to suffer while the wealthy thrived. James made calls, wrote checks, and arranged for Clara to receive support. He even connected her with a small business grant, helping her start a modest catering service from her home. Noah's gratitude was quiet but profound. He didn't speak much about the help they were receiving, but his eyes told James everything he needed to know. The sparkle of hope returned to the boy's gaze, and the first time he smiled fully, genuinely, James felt something crack open inside him. A heart that had long been armored against the world, finally softened. Months later, James watched from a distance as Clara's catering business began to grow. Neighbors praised her cooking, local stores stocked her baked goods, and slowly, steadily, the stress and fear that had dominated their lives started to lift. Noah ran home from school with excitement, talking about friends, new recipes his mother had tried, and even small dreams he hadn't dared to imagine before. James realized that the smallest act of noticing, of listening, of caring, had sparked a chain reaction far beyond what he could have predicted. One rainy evening, James found himself standing outside their apartment, waiting as Noah came running down the steps, umbrella barely covering his small frame. "Mr. James," he shouted, a wide grin splitting his face. "Mom says thank you for everything." Clara followed behind, her eyes glistening. "You didn't just give us food," she said softly. "You gave us hope." It was in that moment James understood the power of human connection, of kindness that transcends money and power. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch, in the hope you plant, in the courage you inspire. And perhaps most importantly, he realized that even in a world that often seems indifferent, a single act of compassion can ignite a future no one could have predicted. Before we continue, I want to ask you to pause for a moment. If this story has touched your heart, if you feel even a spark of the hope that James discovered, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more people who need to believe in the goodness of humanity. James continued to visit, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes simply sitting and talking with Noah about school or life lessons he had learned in his own journey. He shared stories of mistakes he had made, of how money and power had never filled the emptiness he now knew could only be filled with love and empathy. Noah listened, soaking in every word, and James realized that mentorship, guidance, and human connection were as vital as the bread that had started their story together. Years later, Noah grew into a young man with a resilient heart, carrying the lessons of kindness he had witnessed firsthand. Clara's catering business became a beloved fixture in the community, known not only for its delicious food but for the story behind it, the story of a boy who never gave up, a mother who fought tirelessly, and a stranger whose compassion changed the trajectory of their lives. James, once a CEO defined by spreadsheets and boardrooms, had become a man measured by impact. He had learned that true legacy wasn't built in towers of glass and steel, but in the hearts of the people whose lives you touch. And as he watched Noah, now thriving, he felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you made a difference, not because you could, but because you chose to. And so, the story that began with a simple request for expired bread ended with full bellies, fuller hearts, and the enduring truth that compassion can cross any divide, no matter how vast it seems. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of small acts of love, please comment below and share your thoughts. Your words might inspire someone else to act with kindness, just as James did. Sometimes, all it takes is noticing, listening, and choosing to act. Sometimes, one small gesture can change a life forever.